I agree. I also think we need to acknowledge even setting boundaries. Like for me, it's an art form. And then if I'm faced by completely new situations, I may not be fully aware where my boundary is because I've never lived through this situation. So how shall I know? I think for me, it's very much like curiosity, but also, yeah, life will happen. And sometimes, like at least in my own story, I had a lot of trauma happening after I did my healing. And then suddenly I sat there and I said, oh, now I need to do a lot of more healing.
Welcome to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist, a podcast dedicated to empowering you to take control of your life, learning valuable strategies for healing, and looking at mental health through a trauma-informed lens. Get ready to feel empowered and confident in managing your symptoms. And now, here is your host, licensed clinical social worker, EMDR therapist, and certified clinical trauma professional, Jamie Vollmoeller.
Welcome to Good Enough. I am your host, Jamie Vollmoeller, and today we are here with Natalie
Jovanic. That's fine. No problem.
They are a registered master therapeutic counselor and trauma recovery coach specializing in helping individuals worldwide who have experienced trauma and loss. They use an integrative approach to trauma recovery, combining IFS-informed parts work, somatic approaches, EMDR, and anti-oppressive practices. Natalie is dedicated to supporting clients in regaining control over their lives, firmly believing that healing is possible regardless of past experiences. Natalie is also the author of a memoir, A Brave True Story, where they share their personal journey of healing from childhood abuse. Welcome to the podcast, Natalie. So glad to have you here.
Thank you, Jamie. I'm very happy to be here and I'm curious what we will talk about.
So honestly, I love counselors who bring their personal experience into their work, because I just feel like it helps us relate so much more deeply with our clients when we've been through what they've been through. So my first question to you would really be like, how and I'm sure you go through this in your book, but how did your childhood kind of influence the path you took in becoming a counselor?
Like, if I'm honest, I wouldn't be a counselor without my childhood. So I became a counselor after I did a lot of my own healing. I also need to say, I have a diverse experience with counselors and approaches and therapists. And so some of them were well and some of them didn't. So I think my healing journey was successful. However, I also had some obstacles in it, which taught me a lot around how I want to be as a counselor and where I need to be very mindful. I think my own journey about healing childhood abuse taught me a lot around stigma. Like there is this kind of thing around, I thought when I was healed, I would never need to face stigma again. But then I noticed, oh, no matter how healthy I am, I will always face stigma. So there was this kind of disappointment after I felt like, okay, I've worked through a lot of that. Like I experienced, just to be specific, I experienced sexual abuse. My family was largely emotionally abusive. My stepfather was physically violent, but in the end, my sister was more targeted by it because I'm this type of person. If there is a threat of physical violence, I shut down. So I did everything I could to avoid it. But I'm aware that later on in my life, it didn't necessarily help me with boundary setting and all these kind of things. So I think for me, there are very different layers on how we can heal. And I'm aware, I understand people have experienced childhood abuse better than people who had a happy childhood, because I kind of get the complications around how to learn to set healthy boundaries. And I think we often simplify it so much. However, for somebody who has experienced abuse, it's not that easy because, first of all, I wasn't even aware about my boundaries. I didn't even know where they were. So a lot of my journey was playing around and experimenting, and I now have them. And it also is an everyday process to check in with me. Where's my boundary? To check in with maybe parts that sometimes feel overpowered by others, and like, how can I take care of them? So there is a diversity in the experience. And I think it is helpful for me to also explain clients' expectations, because I think sometimes the expectations is, first of all, their self-blame. oh, why haven't I done it better? Or why am I not better in it? But then the expectation is I change it immediately. And then I say, hey, be aware there may be complex inner dynamics within you that sometimes prevent you from having the healthy boundary you want to have. And our job here is to become curious so that you can be more aligned with yourself.
Oh my God. Love everything you just said. I resonate so deeply as like a fellow trauma kid of like not the word having boundaries, like even knowing what a boundary was. It's not really an option when you're in survival mode in childhood, right? So I loved all of that. So in IFS work, and I love that you do IFS because I want to be trained. I am not trained yet, but I had a therapist who did IFS along with EMDR, and that was very, very helpful for me because, as you were saying, with your childhood, like you went into shutdown mode, and that does come out in adulthood, right? So we have these different roles that we play throughout our lives that will pop back up, and if we're not aware, can kind of take over and make us do things that our true self would not like to do.
Yes. Okay. I need to say my approach to part work draws on different modalities.
Uh-huh.
And I think for childhood abuse, what I really love is also the work from Janina Fisher.
Yeah.
And she speaks about healing the fragmented self of childhood survivors or trauma survivors. I'm not sure. Like
Mhm.
she has a book about it, and I attended a lot of her training. And she speaks about the theory of structural dissociations, which explains when trauma happened to us, that parts of us become these rational parts that are focusing on surviving and that are just don't want to face overwhelming emotions, and the emotional parts that we usually put behind a wall. And so a lot of my own healing, which I did in Spain, was reconnecting the different parts. And I also think we live in a world where rational parts are favored, but the emotional parts are often stigmatized and not appreciated. And so I really learned to appreciate all of my parts. And like, even if they have difficult emotions, they often tell us that something is off in the present moment. I don't fully agree that if they are activated, that it's only the past. Like in some occasions, yes, but very often, if, for example, my part shows up that is angry, I need to check in the present relationship, what is going on, and maybe where do I miss out on a boundary.
Yeah.
So I really learned to discern that, yes, like sometimes the emotional intensity can be less, but in the end, I still think all of the parts, when they show up, have a meaningful message for us. And it's about how can we start being curious about them, listen to them, and really have a connection with them. So I did a lot of inner child work in my own healing journey. And I also did a lot of this work to reconnect with, and I think in inner childhood, they talk it magical child, like this healthy part of us, which is connected with our intuition, which is kind of knowing the path for us. And so I know that there are many different concepts out there and different labels. So in a way, I draw from very different modalities. I also like, if inner child doesn't resonate with people, we completely let it go. But I think a lot of wholeness is that we can be in relation with our parts, and that the next step then really is how can we release the burden that the parts carry, because some of them just carry a heavy burden and they change over time. Like parts are just like good friends. Like as we change, our parts change. And
Yeah.
also parts may really depend on the context. And I have different parts that show up in different contexts. And so like when we start valuing them, also we can more and more connect with our self internally, I would say. So I use parts work a lot. I use it for myself. I also use polyvagal theory a lot because I think it explains us how our nervous system responds. And
Hmm.
yes, then I'm trained in EMDR. So I use also EMDR for memory processing, but you can use EMDR for parts work too. So I
Yeah.
combine these different elements. And it really depends on the client because we are all different. And sometimes one modality doesn't work in the moment. Maybe it works later on, but like, it's really like, how can we meet clients where they are at?
Yeah. And I love that all the modalities that you're like, they're all about the nervous system regulation and
Yeah.
bringing it back to our bodies. And that is so very important for all of us trauma survivors, because we're really good at the logical. We're really good at
Mhm.
the problem solving, right? But we're not so good at being in our bodies and listening to our bodies and being present in the moment.
Mhm. Yeah.
So yeah, how do you approach this with clients? Like, how would you tailor your approach to, like, or do you want to give an example of a client that you've done some work with those approaches, how it would look?
Okay. Like primarily it's get to know each other process. This comes, okay. In the first session, I usually have a conversation, what has happened to the client, where they're at,
Yeah.
what they want to work on. And then it's really like, if I'm honest, I start with parts work. And since I have an integrated approach, like in theory, EMDR also has a stabilization phase, but like the first stage of trauma recovery for me is really like, what are the symptoms the client is having? Where do we need maybe to work on stabilizing and creating more inner safety? So it's not about jumping to the most traumatic events and working with them, but it's really about what's going in their lives, and also where are those parts that are really scared of the process? How can we connect with them, understand their concerns? So it is a stepwise process. And I usually start working with the nervous system, working with boundaries, working with the different parts, and then seeing like, when is the client confident that they can look at the past, and when have we regulated the system enough that we can do the trauma reprocessing. And honestly, this process is so individually unique. Like I work with some people who live with DID, and like for them the process is more slow in general. Like
Yeah.
I would say the more complex the trauma was that happened to an individual, the slower the process. But also it's not something to be frustrated about, but it's also something to really pace it and be respectful for the part. Like what I learned is the most important thing is that we really are respectful in the rhythm with the different parts, and that we don't overwhelm them, that we don't overload them, so that we really take it step by step. And I know it can sometimes be frustrating for people because it may be slower than they hope it would be.
Yeah, we get that a lot for at our practice, because we're known for EMDR, and people come in and be like, I want to do processing. And it's like, that's not exactly how it works. Like, we got to make sure that your
Mhm.
nervous system's regulated. We got to make sure that you're ready to go into that and you have good coping skills, so that in between our sessions, we know you can regulate yourself. And if things come up, you're going to be okay. And I do think that's really important, because I've heard a lot of horror stories of people who weren't resourced properly before going in, or,
Uh,
all of those things that can be. I understand why people want to like go fast and break things. Like, I'm very much that person that's like, yeah, let's just get to the hard stuff. But you need to get to the deeper stuff. Or what I found too is that with me, I've even had therapists that have jumped to just like processing, and my parts were not ready for that. Right. So
mhm.
my brain would not allow me to go there. Like, it would just be blank. And that's even more frustrating for your client, because they feel like, well, even this thing that's supposed to cure me isn't working, and nothing is going to cure you. But that's just their thought process.
Yes, like I honestly, I've learned, like, I think if EMDR isn't, the memory reprocessing of EMDR isn't working, it's because something is missed out in the earlier steps. And I think sometimes it's useful to go back and forth, and it's not being a failure. It's really like acknowledging, like peeling an onion. If there is something that isn't working, we need to look at, okay, what happens underneath it, what we haven't seen yet, what we haven't found out yet, and how can we connect, whether it's a part or whether it's maybe a resource that's still missing. And I think also sometimes it's really building first up positive resources. I think many people aren't aware how many positive resources they have because trauma disconnect us from it. And I also think often the narrative around trauma is only focusing on the negative symptoms.
Yeah.
And I need to say, in my own life, I have a really good intuition. And I know in the end it came from the trauma that happened to me. But on the other hand, it's a really helpful resource to have.
Yeah.
And so it's really about normalizing the process and being aware. It's sometimes a back and forth, and sometimes, if you work 5 minutes on a memory and then we need to take a break, that's perfectly fine because you
Yeah.
already started integrating it. And I think we sometimes have very rigid expectations that we also put out there how easy it's supposed to be, but it's not that simple.
No. I think anyone who's experienced, especially complex trauma, it's kind of like a lifelong journey, even, and you take breaks, right? You have periods where you're
Mm-hmm.
really good, and then you have periods where like something will happen, like you lose a loved one, and it brings up a lot of, you know, emotion, and we need to, and some old triggers, and we need to kind of go back and work on that again. And I think as life changes, we change and we look
Mm-hmm.
at things differently.
Yeah.
So, it's, for me, recovery is more about doing better than I did before. So, even if I still struggle to set a boundary, if I set it sooner this time than last time, like that's a win, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
going to look at that as a positive thing. Um,
I agree. I also think we need to acknowledge even setting boundaries. Like for me, it's an art form. And then if I'm faced by completely new situations, I may not be fully aware where my boundary is because I've never lived through this situation. So how shall I know? Like, I think for me, it's very much like curiosity, but also yeah, life will happen. And sometimes, like, at least in my own story, I had a lot of trauma happening after I did my healing. And then suddenly I sat there and I said, oh, now I need to do a lot of more healing. And on one hand, it was useful because I could draw on the resources I already had. But on the other hand, it was like, I think I had this naive expectation once I've healed my childhood, I will never have trauma again. This didn't
yeah.
work out well.
And I feel like a lot of people feel that way, and they do feel, I've had clients that have like graduated therapy and then something happens and they come back and they feel like such a failure. And I think it's really, really important for people to know that that's not a failure. Like that's part of life, and
Mm-hmm.
trauma's going to happen. It just
Yeah.
happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, when we're talking about boundaries, right? What are some of the boundaries that you think that your clients have struggled the most with?
Okay, here's the thing. Like, since I'm non-binary, I work a lot with gender diverse people. So on one hand, I would say boundaries with the dominant group are really complicated. And the other huge area where I see boundaries with the family system are extremely complicated. And there is a very, in even romantic relationships, it is really sometimes a complicated thing to say, is it worth staying? Do I need to leave? And making this decision. And I think everyone has their own decision. Like, I don't have contact to my family of origin. Like, on one hand, my mother died when I was young, but then my father and my sister, they never changed. So they
Yeah.
had very emotionally abusive behavior. And at one stage in my life, I said, no, I don't want to be there anymore. And this was my choice. I also know it comes with a price, because if you don't have connection with your family, you lose a lot of safety around it. So
Yeah.
I don't have a solution for clients, so I can give the space that they can explore how they want to navigate it, like especially when family members are either unwilling to acknowledge the truth or they never change. And so I think it's complicated. And I'm not sure what is the right boundary in this moment. Like we all need to find it out by ourselves.
Yeah, I think that, setting boundaries with family members is a really common theme that I hear my clients talk about. And a lot of that has to do with, whether or not they trust their own judgment, or
Mm-hmm.
they're feared of being shunned, or they're feared um that they're not going to be liked anymore,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
or that they're going to be berated, right? It really depends on like what their history was. But I think that so many of my clients, when they start, like it either goes one of two ways, right? For us trauma kids who've never set boundaries, we either set those boundaries and our parents are, responsive, or our family members are responsive and say like, we understand, I'm sorry, let's repair now and move forward, right? Or you have parents that are just narcissistic and in complete denial.
Mm-hmm.
And in my family, we've also had that and had to cut people off because we, set the boundary with them, and then they just gaslight you. And there's only so long that you can do that, though, where it's like, I love my family and I want to be with them, but I also need to love myself
Mm-hmm.
enough to not put myself through this repeatedly.
Mm-hmm.
Which was really, really hard when when my husband were going through that, because you never want to cut somebody out. And you understand that even those people, they have their own trauma, right? Like
Mhm.
there's a reason they are the way they are. And we can know that and have empathy for them. But I think that's been the hardest thing for a lot of my clients, is to recognize that some people are not going to change, and then making that decision around, how do I navigate that now,
Yeah.
um, for
And
myself?
it's complicated. I would even say if somebody starts to set boundaries with their family system, in the beginning, there's just more tension. Like sometimes they are lucky that the other person immediately respects it, but sometimes there is resistance.
Yeah.
And so then the difficult balance is, how long do you hope that change is possible? And when do you really say, no, this behavior is not respectful for me and I need to protect myself? Like there is a very delicate balance, and every person needs to in the end find their own answer in this journey.
Yeah, and I think it's also like some people might just take a break, right?
Mhm.
They're trying to set boundaries. They know their parents trying, but it's still not
Mhm.
where they'd like it to be, and maybe they just like, okay, I'm going to take a break for a little bit. Not that they're not going to talk to them; they don't need to announce that, but just for their own, so they can
Mhm.
gear up again to get ready to continue to be consistent with those
Mhm.
boundaries,
Mhm.
and that's important for our self care,
Yeah.
for sure. So, other than like family systems, like what other issues do you see? For me, I know a lot of people that don't trust their judgment might have issues setting boundaries
Mhm.
because they feel like um they're wrong. Um
Okay, I think when it comes to boundaries, one of the dynamic which is difficult is if somebody has learned as a child to take on responsibility that is not theirs,
mhm,
like responsibility for other people's emotions. I think it can be really hard to set boundaries because there are those parts that feel responsible for the emotions. So we need to work with these parts first so that there is a better understanding about what's healthy and what's not.
yeah.
And the other thing is, and I think this is sometimes these are these loyal parts with our family members, or those parts that understand their trauma very well. It is a little bit having, like, putting the part that holds the empathy first, but forgetting about the other parts, like maybe the anger part, maybe other parts that tell me, oh, there's a boundary violated. And so I think this can prevent us from having boundaries. But as I said, like, these are really, really long processes. Like sometimes I work with clients who are in their 40s and then they say to me, well, why did it took me so long to identify this? And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, we can't force the process. It's really like, we can just work with what we are aware of in the moment. And if we aren't aware of the dynamic, we cannot work with that. So, and this is a bit like, I think there is where we need to have patience with ourselves and also compassion, because if we are not aware of it, how shall we know? Like, I noticed a part of me that had extreme fear of abandonment in my early 40s, and I wasn't aware of this part, and it never showed up in my healing journey before. And suddenly I was sitting there with a really intense body emotion. And so I think we need to be aware that it's really like a process, and we cannot
Yeah.
know everything in the first 2 years of our healing.
No, yeah. I mean, for me, I know I have two distinct parts that tend to be opposing. And like one of them, I say she's my people pleasing me. And then I have my like, don't give an F, Jamie. Like that's
Hmm.
teenage me. That's like the hard boundaries. I'm done. Right. And a lot of my work with my therapist has been around trying to create harmony between those two
Hmm.
parts,
Yeah.
because teenage me is very like that angry, like we need a boundary, and the people pleasing part of me is like the bleeding heart that's like, but everyone needs us. And she's like, no. So, and it's still a work in progress for me now, even like I, but I'm aware of it. So like you were saying, it's easier for me now if I have something coming up for me at the end of the day, I'll check in with myself and be like, all right, who in the family here is upset, and let's have a conversation about it. And we end in a family hug, and it's really like it's reparenting yourself.
Yes.
It's reparenting those like parts of you and learning to have self-compassion, especially towards the parts of you that like my teenage self, that was a part of me that all my other parts were afraid of. And I tend to like push down because you don't get a lot of positive attention or feedback when you're being aggressive, right? So that was a part of me that was repeatedly pushed down. But what would happen is she would bubble up because
Mhm.
she was needed, because you can't just let everyone walk on you all the time. So yeah, it's really is a process, and it gets easier. That I will say, it gets easier, and I'm more able to recognize, oh, I'm struggling with wanting to help other people and wanting to set this boundary. And now we have to have a conversation about middle ground and what we can do that's going to make the whole self happy and keep us safe and calm and not in chronic stress mode. Because I think that's what the lack of boundaries too, it just perpetuates this chronic stress because people just take on more
Mhm.
and more and more trying to help everyone. And it's like a really unrealistic expectation. And most of the people that are, taking, because we're such givers, we tend to attract people that don't really give, and they just suck our energy out. So,
I agree. Like, I think for me in boundaries, the part that took longest to navigate was the empathetic part that really understood where the other side came from
yeah,
and really, being aware the part is there, but then also saying, no, I don't care in this moment. My boundary is more important.
yeah,
And you're really right. Like, I knows in my body if something is off with my parts. And so
yeah,
then if I have connected with them and sorted that out, I feel the calmness in my body. And I think this is always like, when I feel this turmoil, I know, okay, there's something I need to attend to, whatever it is. And then they
yeah,
all talk to me. And then I'm like, okay, now, how do we navigate and take a step forward? And I also think parts can have different boundaries. And so then it's really, how can we negotiate it?
yeah.
But the boundaries of the parts are valid.
Yeah, and that's really, I think that's part of the lifelong journey, is just like figuring out different roles at
Mhm.
different times too, for all those parts, because the, the roles that we have at one stage in our life is not necessarily going to be productive or helpful in another stage of our lives.
Yeah.
And learning to just be more aware of those body sensations. For me, I've been in therapy since I'm 8 years old, right? So I had a lot of therapists that were more like CBT and talk therapists. And I didn't really get into like any brain based or really trauma focused counseling until I became a therapist and knew what it was and sought out those therapists, right? Because I didn't know what was out there. But the difference in my progress when I was doing more trauma informed care was really, really significant. And I was listening to your podcast, Trauma Demystified, and you went beautifully into, why talk therapy is not always the best thing for trauma survivors.
Yeah.
Um,
Like, I tried traditional psychotherapy, which didn't work at all. Like, honestly, apart from the thing that I don't know, I found our relationship quite toxic, but when I now look back, but I didn't get her. Like, I didn't even know what was expected from me. And I was lucky enough to really find those people who did the body orientation and who didn't talk that much. And it really helped me so much in my recovery, and they were all trauma informed. And then when I became a counselor, I kind of needed to sort out all the different approaches and also the understanding not all approaches are trauma focused or trauma informed. And this was really like in my naive mind, I thought we all would be trauma focused as counselors, and I'm aware we are not. And I think for many clients, it can be really confusing. Like, I agree, like CBT, yes, sometimes it's useful to change my thoughts, but it doesn't change the body sensation. And so there is something missing.
Oh yeah, I always said it was like playing whack-a-mole, right? So like
Hmm.
I knew how to, rationalize my way out of it. I was very good at that. I knew all these thoughts were irrational. I knew all these thoughts were like not helpful to me, and it just felt like I was a hamster on a wheel. Um or the analogy of whack-a-mole, where like a negative thought would come up, I'd knock it down, and another one would pop right back up, and I'd knock it. It was just mentally exhausting. And then
Yeah.
I felt even more like how do I not have my anxiety under control? I've been in therapy forever, like this. And I had it under control in that I was a successful human and I functioned well, right? On the outside, no one would know that I really struggled. But internally, every day was really
Hmm.
exhausting, just mentally battling with yourself.
Yeah.
That is because like I could know logically, but I say it to my clients all the time. It's like, I didn't feel it in my body. In my body, my chest was still tight.
Hmm.
My muscles were still tight. I was still on high alert. So no matter what I said to all of these anxious thoughts that were coming up, it didn't really matter because my body and my nervous system are like, no, like we're in panic mode right now. And I
Hmm.
didn't know how at that time to, calm it down. And that I think, um, it's really kind of tragic. And I don't remember learning I took one class in grad school on mindfulness, and that
Hmm.
was it. That was it. Like, there was nothing in grad school about like bringing, and all of these modalities that really are quite trauma informed and body based are very expensive to train in
Hmm.
and very, very hard to get into. Um, so I do think that the public needs a little more education on that and why it's so important.
I would hope so. Like I still like there's a part of me which is like some of these models were developed when we didn't even know or understand trauma. And why don't we adjust the models? Like there's just like, and I think there needs to be more communication on for clients to understand, no, they are not failing in therapy. It's just like the model is not for their experience. And
Yeah.
you need to really still, personally, I believe any sort of healing is a combination of body, mind, and emotions and spirit. And somehow we need to integrate all of that. But it's not all of the models follow this path.
No, I think unfortunately
Them
most
don't.
therapists are probably not doing that. It's more just a lot of venting from what I hear from my clients. And although that feels good, right? It's the analogy is it's cutting the grass. So
Yeah.
you need that every week to just cope and get by, and not much is really changing. And when you go back to the body and you really do that deeper work and give yourself the tools to help regulate yourself and learn self-compassion and learn how to accept all parts of you, rather than push them aside or call yourself names, then we can start to really rip out the problems by the roots. And not that they don't ever come up again, because another seed can plant and there comes that weed, but it's a lot less maintenance. Like, it just you feel more calm on a day-to-day basis than when you are trimming the grass every week
I
because
agree.
it changes.
Yeah, like I also think like when I did my training in Spain, one of the most important element was that how I look at the client influences the client's results. And so if I come from the belief that trauma cannot be healed and that the client can only develop coping skills or that their life is messed up and they can just talk about it and nothing happens, this will influence the result the client will get. And so this is a bit like I think sometimes we need to be aware even some ideas in the field is you can only cope with trauma, you can never heal it. So like and these kind of I think these ideas are still out there, and some clients are just also stuck because maybe they work with somebody who believes that they can never get better. Like one of my counselors told me I was such a complicated person. I would never have a healthy relationship. And she didn't know anything about me. I think she was like, it was really stigmatizing. And it took me honestly 5 years to heal that. But like, I felt crushed. But I think she kind of projected on me something which I wasn't, well, she hardly ever talked to me. So, um, like
But
there
it's
was
her
nothing
own
we could
fear
work
of
with.
dealing with it. But I
Yeah.
think that's because, the average therapist probably doesn't have the same tools to really help people work through and learn how to regulate and
Hmm.
overcome and really, because most of the successful people I know have a lot of trauma. So it's not that we can't be successful humans.
No.
It's just it might, and we tend to have a lot of drive because we always had to pick ourselves up and
Hmm.
survive, right? So I totally agree with you. I think you can heal from trauma, but I think that healing is a journey and it's peaks and valleys,
Yeah.
and we can't expect to never, like you said, be traumatized again in our life. It's just not, it's
It's,
not a reality.
no, it's unrealistic. But I also think recovery gives you the tools. No matter what happens to you, how can you navigate that from an empowered space?
Yeah.
Like, we can't avoid what happens to us. Like, it will happen. And then the thing is, how it can be navigated. And so I think, like, when we look from it from resilience or post-traumatic growth perspective, like, we have these tools within us. And I disagree with some of these views on trauma that, people are forever broken when they have experienced it. No, we can be fully functional, healthy human beings.
Yeah, for sure. And it might take a minute for someone to get to just
Mm.
that regulation and learn how
Yeah.
to do. And being in your body at first, I'm also going to say, is really uncomfortable. If you're someone that's lived in a chronic stress body that's chronically
Hmm.
tight, to
Yeah.
actually stay in that body and really like sit with it and wait for that feeling to pass and learn how to breathe through and really it can be a little overwhelming. So some people have to do that in shorter
Yes.
spurts so they work up to like being able to sit with that for longer periods.
Like,
um
I always say incremental steps. Like, I work with some people who have chronic pain. So to some degree, we really discuss, is it useful to be in your body in this moment? Like, like, we need to be aware that there are symptoms and conditions and it goes together. And so if parts don't want to be in the body because just too extremely painful to be in the body, like, there's really, like, how can we navigate that?
yeah, and that's entirely valid too. I was thinking of what you said too about like, when you're going to a talk therapist and sometimes they validate, right? And for a trauma survivor, I think what was so from like 8 to 12, I went through multiple different therapists, but they all treated me like, oh, poor baby, oh,
Hmm.
poor you. And that kind of mindset just made me feel even more like
Hmm.
hopeless and like nothing was ever going to help me. And it just made me sad. And then I had a therapist and she wasn't like super trauma informed therapist, but at least she was like, okay, like let's take ownership of what you do have control over. And you're really smart. So go to school and do this. And she gave me back some of my control and power. But with my staff, I'm very like, we're very big in our training on, confronting clients on their issues and not over um, empathizing with our clients. Because I think that's part of the issue as therapists when people aren't properly trained. They resonate a lot with what their clients say because most of us got into this field for a reason and they want to validate it maybe because no one validated them. But when we're only validating and we're not teaching tools, it's just validating the fact that they're a victim and no one
Yeah.
wants to feel like a victim.
Yeah. Like, in my own journey, I did a lot of healing with coaching,
Yeah.
because I found coaching far more empowering. Like, my first therapist, I don't know, it felt to me like pity, and pity is for me the most horrible thing you can do because it felt so disempowering. Because I
Yeah.
was sitting there and I'm like, okay, you think I'm doomed for the rest of my life, so why do I even sit with you? So I found coaching, and this is why to some degree I draw from some coaching modalities, because I think, in contrast to talk therapy, they give you tools. They give
Yeah.
you something. And so, yes, like, tools are really important. And also the thing, like, where do you have empowerment? And in the limitations you are in, how can you empower you in that? And
Right.
so I think, like, giving power back to clients is so important for trauma recovery, because, like, it really gives them choices. So yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, and choices are super important, especially because most of us that are in childhood trauma recovery didn't have many
Mm.
choices. And on top of that, that we're judged for some of the things that we had to do to survive those situations or how we responded in those situations. And I think that people don't take into account that, like, if sometimes there is no choice. Like, if you
Hmm.
can stand in a place of privilege and be like, well, I would have done this, but not everyone has that option
Hmm.
or the knowledge even of that option or
I,
the resources to connect them to get to those options. I mean, I have some really right-wing family members who will argue with me that, like, people just need to like pull themselves up by their bootstraps and blah 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 blah. And I'm like, not everyone can do that. What if you have no money, you have no car, you have no way to
hmm.
get to any of the places that you need to get food. You have no, like, it's not
Hmm.
that simple. And I think it's really easy for um people when they haven't experienced trauma, which is also why the first thing I said to you is like, I love that you have lived experience and are a therapist because it's just, they don't have that lived experience of knowing what they might not know. And
Yeah.
even if like, I think as trauma kids, we tend to be more sensitive to diverse groups and what they could be going through because we know that people kind of had blinders on for our experience. So I think we tend to ask more questions and be more inquisitive before we pass judgment on people. We tend to give them like the benefit of the doubt a little more than the general public.
I agree. And also, I think my own lived experience and also the healing, it tells me it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah.
Like, and to some degree, it is unfair because, like, we are not responsible what happens to us. So, in the end, the only choice, like, the way to freedom is to take responsibility for it. But we weren't responsible for it when it happened to us.
Yeah.
So, and I think this is a bit where there's a delicate balance when the narrative around healing can become victim blaming,
Hmm.
because I don't think that is fair and nobody deserves that. But on the other hand, the only path to freedom is taking responsibility for our own healing. But then if you just financially look how much it costs to heal, um, this
It's a
is a
lot.
privilege to do it. And like, I don't know, in my own practice, I integrate anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices just because of my own journey. I know a lot around privilege just because I'm non-binary. So how can I take responsibility in those areas where I have power? And also in my business, how can I try to keep the services accessible? Because to some degrees, sometimes I look at these pricing and I'm thinking the only people who can afford this are people in very high position of power in the economy. And so
Yeah.
the thing is really like, I find it complicated and really finding this kind of thing like, how can we keep it accessible? And yes, I still need to run a business. So there are so many layers to that.
Yeah, I think that's what broke my heart when I became a business owner because I jumped on every insurance panel ever and was like, oh, we're getting all these clients. This is great. We're helping all these people. But it was not financially sustainable to take Medicaid, Medicare,
Mm,
like every insurance under the sun, and actually pay my people a living wage, right? Like
mhm.
it was either they were going to make peanuts, and where we live is very expensive to live, and that's not going to be sustainable for them or their clients, right? Because they're going to go get other jobs. Or, we have to switch to self pay.
Mhm.
And that also allowed us to afford us to take these trainings that really can help our clients. So yeah, that's been a journey we're navigating too. Our goal one day is to open up like a sister nonprofit. And for
Mhm.
now, we at least have like an internship program where we let people come in either pro bono or like very, very low fee
Yeah,
so that they're getting some support, but it is a balance.
it is complicated. Like, and there is sometimes a really inner conflicts associated with it.
Yeah. Um, but I think that it they're doing things like this and like the
Mhm.
podcast that you host, I think also provides a lot of knowledge to people so that they know where to look, right? They might not be able to get that. It's always better to have that one-on-one with your own therapist and do your own healing and have someone to guide you on that journey. Unfortunately, like you said, not everyone has those resources. But Trauma Demystified, Good Enough with a Trauma Therapist, I think those podcasts like that give people a kind of a starting point to know
An idea.
about like where they can look to start trying to heal and make
Yeah.
themselves feel better.
Also, I would say, like, what I try to do is also like, how can I give my clients tools and stuff like that they can use outside of sessions so that they don't need constant sessions. So it's really like the journey and it depends on where people are at and what they need. But like the thing really is, I think a lot of healing can be done outside of therapy. This is,
I think that it should be done outside of
yes.
therapy, right? Because it's like the world is then like where you go practice all the stuff we talked about in
Yeah.
here. And that'll reinforce in your brain that you can do these things. If we're just talking about it and there's no action, you're never going to believe you can do it, right?
Yeah.
So it is really about practicing outside of therapy. And it's funny. It's like I feel like there are clients that don't want to. They just want to come in and be like, wave your magic wand and fix me. And it's like, sweetheart, we gotta do this
Mm,
outside. You gotta practice,
yeah.
breathing when we're not stressed out. Like I have so many clients that when they first came in, they're like, well, I practiced that panic attack thing once, and then I had a panic attack and it didn't work. And I'm like, well, you practice it once. Like, we have to practice it multiple times so that when we're in that fight or flight mode, we can access it more quickly because there's more um connection, but like wiring between those neurons to know to do that action, and it's going to come up more quickly for you if we practice.
Yeah.
um and that's super super important.
I don't know. I've forgotten the times, but the truth is, like, I went to a somatic experiencing training from Stacey Hines, and she kind of said, like, to do something under normal stress. I don't know. I think we need to repeat about 300 times, and I could be completely off. But then to do something under high stress, it is more like a couple of thousands repetition. So I try to give clients information like that. It takes time. If you do it 10 times, it may still not work under high stress. So be aware it's really a daily practice. And I think
Yeah.
for me, at least, recovery was a complete lifestyle change. And in this way, it doesn't end because I still apply it because it keeps me healthy. Um, like things like yoga are helpful. Meditation is helpful. Parts work is helpful. And all of these kind of things people can do by themselves when they feel confident enough.
Yeah, and I think it's important for them to do it by
Yeah.
themselves, right? Because like we were talking about, like, you talk to your parts, I talk to my parts. Like, that part is so important
Hmm.
in that process of you checking in with you, because that's, again, you reparenting yourself,
Yeah.
not the therapist reparenting you. And it helps to build self-confidence when we're doing this
Yeah.
outside of the therapy room. And it makes it so that you can leave and go live your life, because I mean, that's my goal as a therapist. I don't want to see people forever.
Mm-mm.
I mean, if they come back, that's great, and I'll be happy to see them again because I miss them. But I don't want to see them forever because I want them to feel better and not have to come see me every week or even every
Uh,
other week.
I agree. Like, I don't know. Sometimes clients come back after 3 years and I see a completely changed person who has become far more confident and we just have a different layer we work on. But like,
Yeah,
it's beautiful to see. And no, I want to see my clients the least longest time possible because then they can do it on their own. So,
yeah. And it feels so much more empowering
mhm,
when clients go out and do it on their own. Like, I had a client who asked to come back to me, but I'm pregnant, not taking on new clients. But I was so proud of her because in her email it said PTA. Like, she has an actual, like, PTA email. And her initial reason to come to therapy was her social anxiety about um interacting with, like, the other moms at the school, and like how it was affecting her son, and a lot of guilt around that, and like serious social anxiety. And she's been out of therapy for a couple of years, and we did work on this in
mhm,
therapy, but now she's like head of the PTA. And I'm
mhm.
like, go you, girl. Like, talk about overcoming your fears.
I
She
agree.
now runs the whole thing, and that's really beautiful to see. And she
Mhm,
was really proud to tell me that because she grew that on her own. Like, that
mhm,
wasn't anything that I had to do with. It's
mhm,
it's just a beautiful, beautiful thing when clients can take what they learn and really, like, run with it in their
mhm,
lives, and start to show themselves that they are capable and they are lovable and they are worthy, and they are good enough as they are.
mhm.
And I think that really does happen outside of the therapy room. I mean, we
I
plant the
agree.
seeds, but
I
they need to nurture them to grow.
I give them tools like seeds, tools, and the space, maybe also maybe the space to look at more difficult parts that's hard to look at on their own. But in the end,
Yeah.
you then take it. Like, I have a client who had financial difficulties. And so they did a lot of their work on their own. And I think for a year, we just had a monthly check in a way that they sent me an email on the status, but they did so much work on their own. And so this is kind of the creativity we can create. And yes, in the end, the work happens outside of therapy. We give tools, plant ideas, maybe help with obstacles, but that's about it.
Well, that's all we can do. Well, and we provide that. I think for a lot of my clients, I provide that, like, safe person. Like,
Hmm.
for a lot of my clients, I'm that first um experience of, like, unconditional positive regard. Like, I'm not mad at you if you don't do your homework. I'm not mad at you if you mess up again. Like, you can get upset with me and I'm not going to respond in a crazy way. I think it's that practicing of, like, what a healthy relationship
Hmm.
looks like is so, so important, which
Yeah.
is also why you have to have a therapist that your therapist should be in therapy, because if they're not healed, that therapeutic, that report might not be so great.
This is what I sometimes experience with supervisors. If I set a boundary and they don't respect it, I'm just like, oh, what's going on with you? Like, yes, I think therapeutic relationship needs to be healthy. If it's not the right therapist, no matter what the tools are.
Yeah, because because it's not going to feel good. And especially for trauma kids, if you don't have that rapport, if you don't have that trust, and trust is very, very hard to build with most of us, you're never going to get to the deeper stuff because you don't feel safe enough coming out and talking about it. Like, if
Mhm.
you don't trust your therapist, you can't talk about those deep, deep, deep issues that keep you up, that no one knows about, because you're afraid of being judged. So that's, for me, like the number one, no matter what modality they're using, just make sure you trust and like your therapist, because that doesn't mean they're a bad therapist if you don't like them. But I've had therapists that just don't jive with me. Like, I had a therapist that it felt like she handled me with kids' gloves as an adult. And I very
Mhm.
much, as an adult, like, felt like, no, I'm a survivor. I'm someone who overcomes things. I am not a victim. Do not look at me that
Mhm.
way. And every session, she was an EMDR therapist. At the end of the session, she'd be like, all right, well, we're going to resource more, even if we didn't do EMDR, because I would cry. And anytime I cried, I was like, no, crying is good. Like, I'm
Mhm.
releasing, I
Mhm.
feel better. Like, I am good. I can go and leave the session and I actually feel good in my body right now. And she would be like, no, we have to do more resourcing. And she would keep me like a half hour extra. And I was like, the fact that you're that concerned about me makes me like feel uncomfortable here, because I'm telling you I'm fine and you don't seem to believe me, which then made me like uncomfortable for me to cry or anything like that, because I was worried that she was too worried. Do you know what I mean?
Okay. It also sounds like there's a power imbalance. Like, okay, for me, one important part of trauma healing is that the therapist can navigate power. Like,
Yeah.
because if you say I'm okay and she is overpowering you and saying, no, you're not, you need to do more, there is a profound power imbalance. Like, I
Yeah.
sometimes work with people who work on loss and I do EMDR. I know the steps to fully integrate it. But if a client says after, I don't know, 5 or 10 sessions, I've done enough, I don't need to do more, I respect that
Yeah.
because they choose how integrated they want to be. And even if they don't go to the so-called zero in EMDR,
Yeah.
like it is what they want. So it's not mine to say, oh, you're not healed, you cannot do that.
Yeah, no, I 110% agree, because it's just invalidating.
Yeah. Yeah.
And most of us have felt invalidated most of
Yeah.
our lives. So when you have a therapist that's also like, no, you can't trust your judgment, I'm going to make this decision for you. Like, that can be really damaging to someone that you're doing deep work with,
Hmm.
because we, again, don't trust ourselves. We don't trust anyone else. But yes. Um, Natalie, if people want to get your book or follow you, where can they find you, dear?
They can find me on Instagram under Bright Horizon Therapies. They can check out my website, brighthorizontherapies.com. They can find the book on Amazon CA or Amazon Com if they want to read it.
Okay. And what is the name of your book again?
A Brave True Story.
A Brave True Story. Awesome. You had a offer for the listeners as well, correct?
I didn't have a full offer. Like if people want to check out my podcast, Trauma Demystified, I'm happy to listen to them. I don't, well, I put it upload every 5 weeks, just also
Okay.
because it is a process. I'm still very much into explaining trauma therapy. I hope over time I get more into tools and sharing more tools around it. But first I want to lay a foundation.
No, I think that's a beautiful resource for people, because Natalie's podcast is more about, understanding trauma. Like, I feel like you're teaching them, like, it's almost like a module, step by step. Like, here's the foundation, here's the next level. And it's a really, really beautiful thing for people who want to understand maybe why they're feeling, or
Hmm.
why they're not healing in that way. And I listened to it and I was like, oh, this is like really, really nice, and breaks it down like beautifully for
Thank
people
you.
to not feel like they're crazy anymore. Like, no, this is a normal response, right? Like, this is normal. And I think when you've had so many poor experiences with people who don't understand trauma or how to treat trauma, it can really feel like, you're the broken one. And I think
Mhm.
that Trauma Demystified does a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful job of explaining like the science and the logic behind why you feel the way you do.
Yeah.
And I'm really
Thank you.
excited for when you get to tools, because I think that's going to be super, super helpful.
Yeah.
But even the basic knowledge is just really, really wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on today, Natalie. Um, I just want to wish our listeners a good week and let them know that they are good enough.
Thank you for listening to Good Enough with the Trauma Therapist. We appreciate you listening. While our host may provide some personal and professional advice, we want to remind you that this show is for entertainment purposes only. Each individual situation is unique, and Good Enough is not a substitute for mental health treatment. If you need a therapist and are located in New York or Missouri, feel free to reach out to us at liemdr.com or resilient-mo.com.